When the Trojan nuclear power plant came online in 1976, it ushered in a new era for the Pacific Northwest. Years of research and development had been poured into nuclear power, which promised to bring mankind into an age of limitless energy. Trojan was the first step in a much grander vision, as dozens more nuclear plants were already being planned across Oregon and Washington. With a designed lifespan of 35 years, Trojan promised to serve our energy needs well into the 21st century. So how is it then, after just 17 years of operation, did we find ourselves here? On September 28, 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited the Pacific Northwest to deliver a speech. This was the dedication of the Bonneville Dam, a major public works project that had been under construction for the last 3 years. The dam was built on the mighty Columbia River, straddling the border between Washington and Oregon. While Bonneville was not the first hydroelectric plant on the Columbia, it was certainly the largest. But it wouldn't hold that title for long. 450 miles up the river in Washington, crews were constructing the Grand Coulee Dam, one of the largest infrastructure projects in the United States. In just a few years, Bonneville and Grand Coulee would transform the Northwest, making electricity accessible to many local residents for the first time.
And so, my friends, that is why, in developing electricity from this Bonneville Dam, from the Grand Coulee Dam, and from other dams to be built in the future on the Columbia and its tributaries, this policy of the widest use ought to prevail.
When Grand Coulee was completed a few years later, its power output was more than 5 times that of Bonneville. Working together, these two dams served as the nation's finest example of clean, cheap hydroelectric power.
Power from Columbia River dams has helped give Oregon and Washington folks the lowest electric rates in America. It's brought electric cooking and water heating within the reach of practically everyone. Our population is growing 3 times as fast as the rest of the country. We need more farmland, more jobs, more industry. We don't have much coal or oil out here, so we have to depend on hydroelectric power for most of our energy.
Over the coming years, dozens more dams would be built along the river, adding even more capacity to the grid. Managing this complex network was a federal agency called the Bonneville Power Administration. Its purpose was to sell the electricity wholesale to local utility companies. In turn, these utilities would sell the power to their customers across the region. Of course, not all utilities were created equal. For example, Vancouver, Washington was served by the Clark County Public Utility District. Since this agency was publicly owned, Vancouver residents paid for their power essentially at cost. Just to the south, Portland, Oregon was split between 2 private utilities, Portland General Electric and Pacific Power and Light. Since these companies sold electricity at a profit, Portland residents were paying much more than their neighbors just across the river. The federal government was well aware of this. For this reason, public utilities were given priority access to the Columbia River's power. Private utilities could only access it as long as there was enough surplus available. If there wasn't, they would have to generate their own power elsewhere. For example, Portland General Electric had several of their own hydro plants on the Clackamas, Willamette, Sandy, and Little Sandy rivers. But as time went on, these plants didn't produce enough power to meet their customers' needs. Columbia River Power was necessary to fill the gap, but since PGE was a private company, they weren't always guaranteed the option. This challenge laid the groundwork for the company's ambitious plans in the coming years. Since the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States had been entrenched in World War II. With an abundance of electricity from the Columbia River, the Northwest became a powerhouse of wartime industry. Shipyard workers cranked out hundreds of naval ships at an astonishing pace. Cheap electricity led to a historic rise in the production of aluminum. Among its many uses, aluminum was used by Boeing, which produced nearly a third of the nation's warplanes out of its plant in Seattle. But unbeknownst to many, the Northwest was contributing to the war effort in a different way entirely. About 160 miles from Portland and Vancouver, the federal government had quietly built a compound in the Washington Desert at a site called Hanford.
Only a few top scientists were aware of the true nature of the immense project. The real reason for the Hanford Engineer Works, as it was then called, was one of the best-kept secrets of the war. Workmen could guess, but never knew. It wasn't until August 1945 that the Hanford secret could be told.
As it turned out, Hanford had played a key role in the Manhattan Project. When the US government was planning to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, they needed a secret place to produce ungodly amounts of plutonium. Hanford had been selected not only for its remoteness, but also for its access to the Columbia River, which provided electricity and cooling power for the atomic reactors. By fate, rather than by choice, the Pacific Northwest had been thrust into the atomic age. With the war now over, scientists turned their attention to peacetime applications of atomic science. Chief amongst these was its potential as an energy source. Atomic power wasn't fully understood, but scientists proclaimed it as a holy grail, an infinite source of energy that would transform life as we knew it. Meanwhile, the post-war years had seen a historic population boom in the Northwest. This was putting a strain on the Columbia power system, and private utilities were the first to feel the squeeze. Portland General Electric knew this wouldn't be sustainable forever. They began developing plans to build more of their own power plants across the region. However, their biggest inspiration would come from the other side of the country. In 1959, plans were approved for a nuclear facility to be built in Pennsylvania. The Peach Bottom Atomic Power Station would be one of the first nuclear power plants in the United States. This project was funded by more than 50 utility companies from across the country. For a relatively small investment, these companies got their first hands-on experience with nuclear power. PGE was one of these investors, and throughout the 1960s, this project would play a key role in their future strategies. Closer to home, plans were taking shape for another nuclear plant at Hanford. Known as the N-reactor, this was developed by the US government with two purposes in mind: to make plutonium for nuclear weapons and to generate electric power for the Northwest. In 1963, groundbreaking for the plant was attended by President John F. Kennedy.
You know that in the next 10 years, I hope the people of the United States realize it, that we double the need for electric power every 10 years. We need the equivalent of a new Grand Coulee Dam every 60 days. Our experts estimate that half of all electric energy generated in the United States will come from nuclear sources.
Just 2 months after his appearance at Hanford, Kennedy would be assassinated in Dallas, Texas. But his words echoed what industry experts had been saying for years. America's power needs were increasing at an alarming rate. Even the massive Columbia hydro plants weren't enough to meet the future demand. To help combat this, the US and Canadian governments signed an agreement called the Columbia River Treaty. This laid the groundwork for more dams to be built farther upstream in Montana and British Columbia. Once completed, this would add more capacity to the system, while extending the benefits of Columbia hydropower to Canadian residents. But these projects were years away from coming to fruition, and even then, they wouldn't be enough to solve the energy shortage alone. The point of Kennedy's speech was that nuclear power was the wave of the future. If utilities began developing nuclear plants now, they might have a chance at beating the energy crunch in the coming years. On February 2, 1967, Portland General Electric announced their plans to build the first nuclear power plant in Oregon. With a generating capacity of more than 1 million kilowatts, this would be one of the most powerful nuclear plants in the United States. The estimated cost was $130 million, or about $1.2 billion today. PGE had spent the last few years studying potential build sites around Oregon. Soon after announcing the project, they settled on a site along the Columbia River, just a few miles south of Rainier and Longview. This would also put it relatively close to Portland and Vancouver, sitting about 40 miles to the north. Previously, the site had been owned by the Trojan Powder Company, a manufacturer of dynamite and other explosives. PGE's new plant would inherit this former name, becoming known as the Trojan Nuclear Power Plant. To help design and build the plant, PGE hired the Bechtel Corporation. By all accounts, Bechtel seemed well qualified for the project. They were involved with industrial construction projects all around the world, and would eventually build almost half of the nuclear plants in the United States. The Trojan plant's reactor core would contain rods of uranium fuel submerged in water. Here, nuclear fission would take place, creating an enormous amount of heat. The water would be pumped into steam generators, transferring the heat, but not the radiation, to a second system of water. This water would be boiled into steam, which would then be pumped through steam turbines. These turbines would turn electric generators, thus producing electricity. The steam would then pass through a condenser, where it was cooled back down into water. This would be circulated back through the system to be boiled into steam, thus continuing the cycle. The condenser itself would be cooled by water pumped in from the Columbia River. On its trip through the condenser, this water would be warmed by a few degrees before being pumped back into the river. As it turned out, this would become Trojan's first controversy. The water coming from the plant would be completely clean and safe, but even a small rise in temperature could spur the growth of algae and parasites, and could have harmful effects on native salmon. The Oregon government put strict regulations on the river's temperature, so PGE had to revise their design. In 1968, the company announced it would spend another $14 million to build a cooling tower on the site. Under this new setup, water from the Columbia would still be pumped into the condenser, but the warmed water would instead be sent to the cooling tower. A natural draft of air would cool the water through evaporation, and this water vapor would escape through the top of the tower. The cooled water would then be circulated back into the system, requiring almost no water to be pumped back into the river. This revised design was praised by regulators and environmentalists alike. While the Trojan project would be a boon to the Northwest power grid, this was only the beginning. PGE was already drawing up plans for 4 nuclear reactors near Boardman, Oregon, and 2 reactors at Pebble Springs. Not to be outdone, Pacific Power and Light was planning to build 6 nuclear reactors in Roosevelt, Washington. They were also planning 3 nuclear plants in Oregon, near Lebanon, Sutherland, and Bandon. The Eugene Water and Electric Board also had plans to build its own plant near Florence. Back up north, 5 nuclear plants were proposed by the Washington Public Power Supply System. 3 of these would be built alongside the N reactor at Hanford, and the other 2 would be built farther west in Satsop. Likewise, Puget Sound Power and Light was planning to build 2 nuclear reactors near Sedro-Woolley. With so many of these projects in the works, the race to the nuclear age was fully underway. Just as the Northwest had made a name for itself in hydropower, it was now destined to set a national example for nuclear power as well. In the spring of 1970, PGE revealed detailed drawings to illustrate their plans for the Trojan site. While the property would span over 600 acres, the plant itself would only take up a small fraction of this. Most of the site would be developed into a recreational space, with trails, picnic areas, and facilities for boating, fishing, and swimming. By doing this, PGE hoped to show that nuclear power was safe for the environment and for local residents alike. But behind the scenes, Trojan was being developed at a rapid pace with little oversight. Nuclear power plants were regulated on the federal level by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. But this agency had come under intense scrutiny over the years, as its standards for nuclear safety were lax and ineffective. The technology was still young, and like many nuclear plants of its time, Trojan was built before the government really knew how to regulate it.
And I think that I was taken, like a lot of Oregonians, by surprise. By that I mean the lay knowledge of nuclear power, I think, was non-existent at that time. What we wanted is someone with definitive authority to accept or deny a license for them to operate. At that time, it was sort of an acquiescence. Oh, well, I guess everything's okay, go right ahead.
Beneath the surface, there were growing concerns among state officials and geologists. One of these was Raymond Corcoran with the Oregon Department of Geology. Corcoran warned that localized fault lines were scattered all throughout the region, yet there hadn't been a comprehensive seismic study of the site. Despite his repeated attempts to raise these concerns, the Department of Geology allowed Trojan to move forward without any objection. Similar concerns were brought up by Len Palmer, a geologist with Portland State University.
We were concerned that they had, and as far as we could tell, never investigated these faults, never looked for them, and never tried to find out whether they were long faults or not. They were making the assumption that the site was good because they already had invested $8 million in site acquisition and investigations, without wanting to go in and find out anything that might be a flaw.
Despite these pleas for a more careful inspection of the site, construction progressed through the early 1970s. Among the first structures to be completed was the plant's visitor center. This opened in November of 1973, a couple years before the plant itself was finished. The center would allow school groups and the general public to learn how Trojan was serving their community. This was achieved through state-of-the-art interactive displays and educational films.
All the end uses of electricity are clean, non-polluting. For example, heating for homes, offices, factories. No smoke means not adding to the load of tiny solid particles in the air. No smoke also means no bad smells. The air at Trojan is clean. Nuclear plants have sculptural forms that can be architecturally pleasing. And the sites are sufficiently extensive so that large areas can be set aside for recreation, enjoyment of nature, as at Trojan.
Throughout the early 70s, public support for nuclear power remained high. Part of the reason for this was a national oil crisis that plagued the US from late 1973 to early 1974. As a result, there was a growing national interest in alternative energy sources. Technologies like wind and solar power were not quite ready for commercial use, but they were now given more serious attention. But above all else, nuclear power was seen as the key to reducing America's dependence on foreign oil. In 1975, the Atomic Energy Commission was replaced by a new federal agency, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Toward the end of that same year, construction had finished on the Trojan plant, and the NRC officially issued its operating license. 2 days before Christmas of 1975, Trojan supplied power to local homes for the very first time. Testing would continue over the next 5 months, and on May 20th, 1976, Trojan was commissioned for commercial use. PGE's years of work had finally come to fruition. Oregon not only had its first nuclear power plant, but one of the most powerful plants of its kind in the United States. At the time of its completion, Trojan's price tag was $460 million, or around $2.5 billion today. Construction delays, rising labor costs, and historic inflation had more than doubled the original estimate. This immense cost would ultimately be passed on to PGE's customers. But in the years it had taken to construct the plant, the energy crisis had started to change Americans' habits. Utility costs had risen significantly in recent years, and people had learned to save money by using less electricity altogether. Energy conservation was the new name of the game. This mindset shift wouldn't happen overnight, but it was already having a measurable impact. Forecasts of future energy demands were already looking far less drastic than just a few years earlier. Case in point, at the time of Trojan's opening, there was plenty of Columbia hydropower to keep up with demand. As a result, the brand new nuclear plant sat unused for the entire summer of 1976. But even after it resumed operation later in the year, it suffered from frequent mechanical issues and unplanned outages. Meanwhile, over the last few years, Trojan had come under fire from anti-nuclear activists. These activists had tried and failed to stop the plant's construction. One of their biggest concerns was the issue of nuclear waste. The uranium fuel rods used in the fission process needed to be replaced on a regular basis. These would remain dangerously radioactive for thousands of years, yet there were no standards for how to safely dispose of them. This issue had already become painfully obvious at Hanford. The US government had been using Hanford as a dumping ground for the nuclear weapons program, and the results were proving disastrous.
The Hanford Reservation is a nuclear industrial park with many private and public facilities. It is here in a massive underground subway system that the largest amount of high-level waste from the weapons program is stored, 55 million gallons. It is also here that the largest leak of radioactive waste ever occurred in 1973, 115,000 gallons before it was discovered. The fear is that the wastes could seep into the Columbia River and eventually be carried into the Pacific Ocean, with disastrous effects on the environment.
The federal government was fully aware of the nuclear waste issue and had promised to build a national dumping site for this purpose. However, these plans would never materialize. PGE had no choice but to store Trojan's radioactive waste on site. For nuclear opponents, this was unacceptable. Oregonians had never implicitly agreed to Trojan itself, let alone the radioactive waste that came along with it. In the fall of 1976, Ballot Measure 9 was presented to Oregon voters. If approved, this would set strict guidelines for any future nuclear plants built in the state. The goal was not to stop nuclear power entirely, but rather to put some safeguards in place. In response, PGE and other local utilities launched a counter-campaign. They argued that Measure 9 was a ban on nuclear power, which would stifle Oregon's ability to meet its energy needs. When the votes were cast on November 2nd, Measure 9 was defeated, with only 42% of voters supporting it. On the same day, a similar initiative was rejected in Washington, despite the clear environmental hazards at Hanford. Feeling ignored by the political system, nuclear opponents took a different approach. On August 6, 1977, hundreds of demonstrators swarmed the gates of the Trojan plant. This protest would last about 38 hours, becoming the first occupation of an operating nuclear plant in the United States. The demonstration was allowed to continue through the weekend, but by Monday morning, state police moved in to disperse the crowd. In the process, 82 demonstrators were arrested for trespassing. This occupation was seen as a turning point in the fight against Trojan, as it brought widespread media coverage to their cause for the first time. Over the years, the anti-Trojan movement would be coordinated by several activists. The legal and political efforts were led by the likes of Lloyd Marbett, Greg Kafoury, and Eugene Rosalie. Protests and public demonstrations were led by activists like Nina Bell and Norman Solomon. More occupations would take place at the Trojan site over the next year, with more participants joining each time. The movement was clearly growing, but Trojan's controversies were just getting started. Trojan's first refueling was scheduled for the spring of 1978. During this process, the plant would be shut down while technicians removed spent fuel rod assemblies from the reactor. These uranium rods, still highly radioactive, would be transferred to a separate pool for storage. This pool was designed to hold about 4 years' worth of spent fuel rods. With 2 years already passed, it wouldn't be long before it would reach capacity. As a result, PGE sought permission from the NRC to store 10 years' worth of rods in the pool instead. In the hearings that followed, nuclear opponents fought hard against the proposal. Concerns about Trojan's seismic stability had only grown over time. People feared that storing more nuclear waste on the site could be disastrous if the plant was compromised by an earthquake. Despite this, the NRC dismissed these concerns and approved PGE's request. Just 2 days later, PGE made a concerning announcement. Bechtel engineers had been doing some work on Trojan's control building, and in the process, they discovered that it was missing some critical seismic supports.
There were large gaps inside the control room walls. In some places, reinforcing steel bars were not connected to one another. In other places, bars as big as telephone poles were missing entirely. The entire control building complex had only 1/2 the earthquake resistance capacity that it was required to have. Trojan was in violation of its operating license, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission ordered PGE to shut the plant down.
Following this discovery, PGE filed a lawsuit against Bechtel for the faulty engineering. However, court documents later revealed that the two companies had discussed the issue more than a year earlier. With the public only becoming aware of it now, Trojan's opponents felt that the timing of all this was a little too convenient.
No one had any idea at the time that PGE was sitting on this kind of information. And throughout the spent fuel pool hearings, the interveners were trying to raise geologic issues, and PGE tried to keep the issues out of the hearings. And if they had not gotten the approval to expand the use of the spent fuel pool, Trojan would have had to have been shut down in 1982. They'd have had no place to put the waste. And one has to wonder about the coincidence that 2 days after the hearings are over, after they prevailed, more than a year after they got this letter telling them that the plant's been built all wrong, at that point they first announced, by the way, we have a problem here with the earthquake design of the Trojan nuclear power plant.
Trojan would ultimately be shut down for the rest of the year, while the NRC conducted its investigation. It wasn't until 9 months later, in January of 1979, that the plant finally came back online. The NRC allowed this, as long as Bechtel fixed the structural issues as soon as possible. It seemed that things would return to normal, but just a few months later, the nuclear power industry would face a PR nightmare of its own.
For many years, there has been a vigorous debate in this country about the safety of the nation's 72 nuclear energy power plants. That debate is likely to be intensified because of what happened early this morning at a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania.
The accident occurred here at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant a dozen miles south of Harrisburg. At about 4 o'clock this morning, 2 water pumps that help cool reactor number 2 shut down.
Late today in Washington, the NRC said, quote, "There's a hell of a lot of radiation in the reactor building," adding that radiation had penetrated the 4-foot-thick walls of that building and was detected as far as 1 mile away.
When the 3 Mile Island event occurred in March of 1979, it became the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history. A combination of mechanical failures and poorly trained staff led to one of the reactors suffering a partial meltdown. Essentially, a nuclear meltdown occurs when the reactor core is not properly cooled, to the point where it literally melts itself and releases incredible amounts of radiation. Fortunately, the plant was designed with a containment building for this exact scenario, so the disaster was kept within the facility. If anything, 3 Mile Island was a disaster in crisis communications. The plant's operators and local authorities had no clear command structure. As a result, contradictory statements were made to the public, and local residents were unclear about how much danger they were actually in. Back in Oregon, PGE had its hands full trying to restore the public's trust in nuclear power. they announced that Trojan would adopt new safety protocols to prevent a similar event from ever happening locally. Likewise, the state and local governments took a hard look at their emergency response planning and found several ways to improve and coordinate their efforts. While these changes were certainly a step in the right direction, many people remained skeptical. The downsides of nuclear power were only becoming more clear as time went on.
Mount St. Helens. For 123 years it was dormant, but today the volcano exploded with a powerful force that turned daylight to dark.
The volcano was over 9,700 feet high, but lost an estimated 700 feet today. At least 5 people have been killed and many others are missing. The smoke and ash is covering a wide area of the Pacific Northwest, as we can see in this infrared satellite photo. The cloud of ash extends from Mount St. Helens eastward across the Idaho Panhandle into Montana. The force of the blast flattened everything in its path. These logs were a forest until 8:30 a.m. Sunday. The landscape is almost colorless because of the heavy coating of volcanic ash.
When Mount St. Helens erupted on May 18, 1980, it was the most destructive volcanic eruption in U.S. history. While the Cascade Mountains provide a scenic backdrop for Washington and Oregon, this event was a harsh reminder that these giants are, in fact, active volcanoes. In the wake of the disaster, there were concerns about the Trojan nuclear plant, which was located just 35 miles from the mountain. Fortunately, the plant was unaffected by the volcanic ash that coated the region, and the devastation had been fairly localized around the mountain itself. Trojan was safe, but there were concerns that St. Helens may flare up again at some point in the future, and the plant may not be so lucky next time. Between this natural disaster and the 3 Mile Island event just a year earlier, there was more doubt about the safety of nuclear power than ever before. As it just so happened, 1980 was an election year, and Oregon voters were soon presented with a new ballot measure. If approved, Measure 7 would prohibit any more nuclear plants from being built in the state, at least until the US government set up a national dumping site for nuclear waste. Unsurprisingly, PGE and most of Oregon's major news outlets argued strongly against Measure 7. In their view, halting any more progress on nuclear power would stifle Oregon's ability to meet future energy demands. However, the recent disasters weighed heavily on the minds of Oregonians. On November 4, 1980, the measure was approved by 53% of voters. Divisive as it was, Oregon had effectively banned any more nuclear plants from being built. By this point, many of the proposed nuclear projects across the Northwest had already been canceled. The reasons were varied, from public opposition to rising construction costs. But at the end of the day, most of these plants had been designed for an energy crisis that never fully developed. Any remaining projects in Oregon were killed off by the 1980 vote. For PGE, the most painful of these was Pebble Springs, which was supposed to be their second nuclear plant after Trojan. At the time of its cancellation, PGE had invested over $100 million into the project. In Washington, construction had progressed on the 5 nuclear plants being built by the Washington Public Power Supply System. The first of these, later named the Columbia Generating Station, was completed in 1984. But skyrocketing costs and public opposition put a serious strain on the remaining projects. Eventually, all 4 of the other nuclear plants would be cancelled at various stages of construction. The financial collapse of these projects was enormous, and the abandoned structures illustrated a hard fact. The promise of a nuclear utopia in the Northwest would never materialize. In the fall of 1983, USGS geologists began a study of plate tectonics in the Pacific Northwest. This was at the request of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which wanted to know the potential seismic risks for any nuclear plants built in the region. Throughout the 70s, it had been theorized that the Juan de Fuca plate was sliding underneath the North American plate, in a process called subduction. While the Northwest has seen a number of major earthquakes in recorded history, it's not exactly a common occurrence. For this reason, people just assumed that this fault wasn't very active. However, the new research revealed something far more alarming. Back in 1960, the nation of Chile had been devastated by a magnitude 9.5 earthquake, the strongest ever recorded on Earth. This was caused by a subduction process between the Nazca and South American plates. Friction between the plates had built up for hundreds of years, eventually resulting in a violent release of energy. 2 decades later, geologists now confirmed that the Juan de Fuca plate was pushing under the North American plate in the exact same way. In other words, the Pacific Northwest was sitting on a geologic time bomb, and there was no telling when it would go off.
In the hypothetical worst-case situation, everything from Eureka to Vancouver, British Columbia, could be potentially affected to the same degree. That's the very, very worst-case situation, but perhaps half of that area is not at all unrealistic. So we're left with a situation where the potential threat from a subduction zone earthquake is very, very great. The degree of disruption of our lives that would accompany such an earthquake is absolutely unprecedented in modern history from natural disasters.
When these findings were announced to the public in 1984, it didn't take long for concerns to be raised about the Trojan nuclear plant. PGE stated that Trojan could withstand an earthquake up to a magnitude of 7 or 7.5. However, a subduction zone earthquake would likely measure above an 8 or a 9. Since earthquakes are measured on an exponential scale, this event would be 10 to 100 times more powerful than Trojan was designed for. Meanwhile, PGE requested, and was approved, to store even more fuel rod assemblies in the storage pool. The pool could now hold up to 21 years' worth of nuclear waste. This was more than 5 times what it was originally designed for. Needless to say, Trojan's opponents were furious. They argued that a subduction zone earthquake would almost certainly bring down the plant and cause a nuclear meltdown. Having decades' worth of nuclear waste on site could make the situation even more catastrophic.
How susceptible is your friendly nearby nuclear power plant to being destroyed or melted down or busted open or leaking its contents into the Columbia River or whatever if there is a serious quake?
I think that the time has come to make this technology accountable for its problems. And I don't believe that the people of this state should be forced to ultimately accept the waste of a technology that they never were given the initial opportunity to decide that they wanted.
As these issues were becoming increasingly controversial, it wasn't long before the world learned what a catastrophic meltdown really looked like.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died. The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence in the form of mild nuclear radiation had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia.
Most of the larger Soviet plants differ in design from U.S. reactors. The major difference is most Soviet nuclear plants do not have containment buildings, the thick concrete dome structures Americans are used to seeing built around U.S. reactors. When the worst American nuclear accident occurred at 3 Mile Island, most leaking radiation was kept inside the containment building, unlike this Soviet accident, where radiation has been measured 600 to 1,000 miles away.
When the Chernobyl nuclear plant experienced a meltdown on April 26, 1986, it became the worst nuclear disaster in history. A reactor explosion and full meltdown released a catastrophic amount of radiation, killing dozens of workers and contaminating over 50,000 square miles. While the nuclear power industry had already been stagnating for years, Chernobyl really marked the beginning of its decline on a global scale. Back in Oregon, activists Lloyd Marbut and Greg Kafoury had been working on a new ballot measure. If approved by voters, Measure 14 would force Trojan to shut down until a national nuclear waste site was established. Effectively, this would close the plant permanently. But as it turned out, this measure would be a tough sell. Decommissioning Trojan would cost an estimated $1.4 billion. If the measure was passed, this staggering cost would be passed on to PGE's customers. At the same time, the US was recovering from an economic recession, and Oregon had been hit especially hard. The timber industry, which had defined the state's economy for over a century, was seeing a historic collapse during the 80s. Closing Trojan would cause hundreds more industrial workers to lose their jobs. It would also drive up electricity rates at a time when fewer people could afford it. As Governor Vic Atiyeh put it, "It's absolutely stupid for Oregonians to do that to themselves." Unsurprisingly, when the polls opened on November 4th, Measure 14 was rejected, only getting support from around 35% of voters. Even with the impending doom of a subduction zone earthquake and the recent horrors of Chernobyl, most people felt that Trojan still made economic sense. Back in 1979, PGE had sued Bechtel over the seismic flaws in the control building. The case had been settled out of court in 1981, and in the process, all of the case documents were sealed by a federal judge, never to be released to the public. It was only now, 6 years later in 1987, that hundreds of pages from the case were anonymously leaked to Trojan's opponents. Among these was a confidential engineering report, which found that Trojan had almost unsolvable problems in design and analysis for earthquake resistance. Much of the plant had been built with block masonry, and, as the report commented, considering the magnitude of earthquake loads and importance of the structure, it was the grossest kind of error. The report concluded that the designers were either naively ignorant or intellectually dishonest. To Trojan's opponents, this report, and the other confidential documents, were proof that the plant was fundamentally flawed. However, NRC regulators seemed convinced that the plant was safe to operate, as Trojan's design was within federal standards. But again, those standards didn't take into account the magnitude of a subduction zone earthquake. In this way, the debate seemed to go round and round with little progress. But in the fall of 1989, the case against Trojan's safety only grew stronger. NRC officials found that the pumps in the emergency core cooling system were clogged with debris.
In case of an accident or earthquake at Trojan, we depend on the plant's emergency core cooling system to shut the plant down safely. However, debris such as scaffolding, tools, and welding rods were recently discovered in the emergency system. This debris may have been there since the plant first began operating. In other words, the emergency core cooling system might never have worked.
The debris could have caused a catastrophe during an accident, but the inspectors say some workers at the plant had no idea it was even dangerous. How is it possible the problem was overlooked for so many years? The NRC inspectors say they were involved with highly technical inspections in other areas of the plant and just hadn't gotten around to the sump pump yet.
This safety violation follows a familiar pattern. The problem is announced, the regulators levy some fines, the utility promises that it'll never do it again, and then the whole issue dies down and we're back to business as usual.
As a result of this oversight, the NRC issued a fine of $280,000. In all the years of Trojan's operation, this was the largest federal fine that PGE was ever issued. Meanwhile, 500 miles to the south, a similar fight had been brewing in Central California. Residents of Sacramento County had gotten fed up with the Rancho Seco nuclear power plant. In many ways, the story of Rancho Seco was very similar to that of Trojan. It had been designed by Bechtel engineers in the 1960s, went online in the mid-70s, and had been plagued by mechanical failures in the years since. Now, in a landmark public vote in 1989, residents approved a referendum to shut down the plant for good. It was the first time that an operating nuclear plant in the US was shut down by the will of local voters. This was a key victory for the anti-nuclear movement as a whole, and it emboldened Oregon activists who hoped to achieve the same result at Trojan. By this point, Lloyd Marbut and Greg Kafoury were already reviving the ballot measure that had failed in 1986. Once again, in the 1990 election, they would ask Oregon voters to shut down Trojan once and for all.
What we didn't know 4 years ago in the 1986 campaign was that the plant had been built all wrong. What we didn't know 4 years ago was that the emergency core cooling system was clogged with debris and had been clogged since the day the plant opened. 4 years ago, we didn't know the full scope of the Chernobyl disaster.
Once again, it was an uphill battle to convey this message to the public. The reality was that PGE's pockets were far deeper than those of grassroots activists. In each election cycle, nuclear issues were breaking records for the most money ever spent on an Oregon ballot measure. And each time, PGE outspent their opponents multiple times over. Much like before, they argued that Trojan was vital to the Northwest power grid. While the exact figures varied, Trojan was supplying something like 15 to 20% of Oregon's electricity. Replacing this energy with other sources would be expensive, and shutting down the plant would have long-lasting impacts on the state's energy supply. On November 6th, Measure 4 was defeated, with only about 40% support. As this cycle kept repeating itself, it seemed that Trojan's opponents would never get their way. But while no one knew it at the time, the plant's end would come far sooner than expected. If you'll recall, Trojan had superheated radioactive water that was pumped from the reactor core through a series of tubes. These tubes were fed through steam generators, where the heat was used to produce steam. But as early as 1979, just a few years after Trojan opened, the tubes were already showing signs of corrosion and cracking. On many occasions, this caused radiation leaks into the steam system, which often led to radiation being released into the atmosphere. Throughout the 1980s, Trojan was shut down periodically to patch these leaking tubes. By the early 90s, new cracks were forming almost as fast as PGE could fix them. But this problem wasn't unique to Trojan. A full decade earlier, the NRC found that at least 40 of the nation's 72 nuclear plants were suffering from this same issue. Most of the failing steam generators could be traced back to a single manufacturer, the Westinghouse Corporation. By 1991, more than 20 utilities across the US had filed lawsuits against Westinghouse. The company had allegedly known about the defect as early as 1964, but had sold the steam generators anyway without informing their customers. Now, dozens of nuclear plants across the country were seeing their steam generators fail much earlier than expected. In the summer of 1991, PGE conceded that their steam generators would need to be replaced. Trojan was licensed to operate for another 20 years until 2011, but the generators only had maybe a few years left in them. Ordering new ones from Westinghouse was an option, but this would cost upwards of $200 million. Meanwhile, Lloyd Marbut and Greg Kafoury were planning to make a third attempt out of their ballot measure in the 1992 election. If PGE wasn't willing to close Trojan, perhaps Oregon voters could make the decision for them. And this time around, the political movement would gain new momentum from an unlikely source.
This is a killer, but keep at it. Remember, it takes desire and effort to reach the top, and there's no better proven method to take you there than Soloflex.
Millionaire Jerry Wilson was the founder of the Soloflex company, which sold exercise equipment from its headquarters in Hillsboro, Oregon. In the last election in 1990, Jerry and his wife Marilyn had put major funding into the campaign against Trojan. This time they would split off into a separate ballot measure of their own. Alongside Marbut and Kafoury's Measure 5, Measure 6 would achieve the same goal of shutting down Trojan. The main difference was that this one would prevent PGE from passing the decommissioning costs onto their customers. A few months before the election, in August of 1992, PGE's board of directors made a decision on Trojan's fate. The plant would continue operating for another 4 years until the steam generators were no longer usable. At that point, in 1996, Trojan would be shut down permanently. The news was shocking, and to many nuclear opponents, this was seen as a major victory. But Lloyd Marbett and other leaders of the movement weren't convinced. They felt that the plant had more than enough issues to shut it down now. Allowing it to operate for another 4 years would only generate more nuclear waste. On the opposing side, PGE and its supporters fought hard against Measures 5 and 6. In their view, the 4-year period was necessary to plan out other sources of power to replace Trojan. Shutting it down too hastily could lead to a dangerous energy shortage. When the polls opened on November 3rd, both measures were defeated, only seeing around 40% support. For the third time in a row, Trojan had been saved by Oregon voters. On November 9th, less than a week after the election, the plant was shut down again for lengthy repairs to the steam tubes. In the meantime, news came out that several NRC officials were deeply concerned about Trojan operating for another 4 years. While the NRC had allowed the plant to keep going, this was apparently a controversial issue within the agency itself. With federal regulators showing doubts about the plant's safety, and the steam tubes getting more expensive by the day, PGE found itself with no good options left. On January 4th, 1993, less than 2 months after winning the support of Oregon voters, PGE President Ken Harrison held a press conference.
Earlier this afternoon, Portland General Electric's Board of Directors voted to accept management's recommendation to permanently cease electric power operations at Trojan.
The news was a bombshell. For 17 years, PGE had fought to keep the plant open despite its many controversies. Only now, on their own terms, did they finally pull the plug. In the weeks following the announcement, PGE began developing plans to decommission the plant. While a handful of nuclear plants across the US had already been shut down, Trojan would be the largest one to date. The industry had no clear guidelines for how to decommission a nuclear power plant, so in many ways, PGE would be pioneering the process. First and foremost was the matter of Trojan's 1,300 employees. By all accounts, these men and women had taken great pride in their work. The plant's issues had been largely out of their control, and now they had the emotional task of saying goodbye to their friends and colleagues. Inevitably, most of the employees were laid off over the coming months. Some would find new positions within PGE, but many would move on to different industries entirely. As one employee was quoted as saying, "Maybe we should all get jobs at Soloflex." Next was the matter of dismantling the plant itself. The plan was to remove most of Trojan's radioactive elements and ship them off to Hanford for burial. In September of 1995, the giant steam generators were carefully removed from the plant. Over the next few weeks, each of them was barged 270 miles up the Columbia River. After arriving at the port of Benton, they were trucked the remaining 20 miles to the burial site at Hanford. The greatest challenge of all would be the massive nuclear reactor. While engineers had originally planned to break it down into pieces, they realized it would be far safer and cheaper to just seal it up as one giant piece. This had never been done before, and it would ultimately take 2 years just to plan out the logistics. In August of 1999, the sealed reactor was barged up the Columbia River. A few days later, it arrived at Hanford, where it was buried in its final resting place. Another major piece of the puzzle was the nuclear fuel rods. In total, Trojan had 781 fuel rod assemblies, which would remain radioactive for thousands of years. This high-level radioactive waste couldn't be stored at Hanford, so it would have to be stored at the Trojan site indefinitely. To accomplish this, PGE commissioned 34 dry storage casks made of concrete and steel. In 2003, the fuel rod assemblies were carefully moved into the new casks. These were designed as permanent containers that would never need to be reopened, even if they were moved to a new location someday in the future. The last major task was demolishing Trojan's cooling tower. This massive structure, standing 499 feet above the Columbia River, had been an icon for a generation of Oregon and Washington residents. In the early morning hours of May 21, 2006, locals gathered to witness the end of an era.
3, 2, 1, fire!
Woo! Yeehaw! That was absolutely beautiful from this side of the river, guys.
In the years since its closure, many locals have claimed that Trojan was the inspiration for the Springfield nuclear power plant in The Simpsons. Series creator Matt Groening grew up in Portland and lived in the Northwest through the late 1970s. While the show's producers have denied any connection, it's not a stretch to think that he may have been inspired by the troubled nuclear plant back home. Adjacent to the former site of the plant, Trojan Park is still open to the public. This recreational space was originally supposed to show the environmental benefits of nuclear power. Now it serves as a reminder of a more timeless lesson, that nature always outlives the machines of man. In the years since Trojan's closure, PGE has shifted its focus toward natural gas plants and wind farms. But ultimately, the Pacific Northwest is still dominated by hydroelectric power. This accounts for about half of the power generated in Washington and Oregon, and about 90% of the power generated in British Columbia. While the Columbia River isn't responsible for all of this by itself, it's still the largest source of hydropower in the United States. This system hasn't been without its own issues, but in large part, it feels appropriate that the Northwest is powered by one of its most precious natural resources. Since the passing of Measure 7 in 1980, Oregon has maintained its effective ban on nuclear power plants. It seems unlikely that nuclear power will ever return here in the future. But if it does, it'll have to reckon with a complicated and controversial past.
Douglas fir where the waters cut through. Down her wild mountains and canyons she flew. Canadian Northwest to the ocean so blue. It's roll on, Columbia, roll on. Other great rivers add power to you. Yakima Snake and the Clicky Tattoo. Sandy, Willamette and Hood River too. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn.